And a very good evening. Welcome to this European Movement webinar. It's a great pleasure to have you with us this evening. I'm Nick Harvey. I'm broadcasting to you from the European Movement headquarters in Westminster. Here with me this evening in person is Tim Hames, who will be the second of our two speakers. And joining us online from Birmingham is Professor Amelia Hadfield, who will be the first of our two speakers. The subject tonight is, will global tensions and Donald Trump's unpredictability lead to a European defence union? And we're delighted to welcome two such distinguished panelists to consider and reflect upon this subject. And without further ado, I will introduce the first of those two panelists. Professor Amelia Hadfield is Dean International at the University of Surrey. She joined the university in 2019 as Head of Politics and International Relations. She is the founder of the Centre for Britain and Europe at the university. She is also director of CIFAL Surrey, which is a UN-sponsored body. I'll let her tell us more about if that arises. She's co-director of the Institute for Sustainability at Surrey, a long-standing Jean Monnet Chair of European Foreign Affairs, and a distinguished broadcaster and commentator. So, Amelia, thank you very much for joining us and for staying on in Birmingham in order to participate. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you. Can I invite you to reflect upon this very interesting subject? And given that you are, I think, Canadian by background, you may have a thought or two about a recent election as well. Amelia, welcome, and over to you.
I do. Thank you ever so much. It's a real privilege. Thank you very much, Nick, and great to be alongside Tim as well. And my thanks to the organisers of the European Movement. This is my first event with you. So it's great to be able to bring the Centre for Britain and Europe at the University of Surrey together with EM. So we have a large menu this evening, and it's going to be great to rattle through it. Let me provide a little bit of the context in terms of US-European relations, talk quickly about security and defence, and then I'll wrap up with where we are in terms of the pact, the EU-UK pact, and then we can dig down into that later on in the hour. So obviously, we're very aware that US President Donald Trump has threatened with varying degrees of menace and seriousness, briefly, to stop protecting NATO allies if they don't increase their defense spending. He's also threatened variously to annex Greenland from the NATO ally Denmark, and again from the Canadian in the room to make Canada the 51st state. Just not going to happen. So the other threats, of course, are alongside impending US troops, cessation of joint exercises with allies, a drastic reduction of US security commitments more broadly, and possibly reducing below the long-term average of, I think it's roughly 80,000 US troops on permanent rotation, so just ducking underneath that as well. So obviously, that's a tremendous shock to the system. One of the first responses, of course, was NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte going to Washington, and I think probably partly due to his Trump whispering reputation, if I can call it that, but having to walk a very difficult tightrope between standing up for the 31 of the military alliances members on the one side, but trying to work with the whims of its most powerful and possibly irreplaceable NATO ally, the other one as well, and that's the United States. So where this puts NATO and Europe is trying to sketch out very quickly indeed how to increase the continent's defense capabilities in the face of revanchist Russia and a capricious United States as well. So you've got EU defense ministers on the one side, and you've got NATO foreign ministers on the other side, variously in various groups, having met in the last couple of months. And of course, the emerging message is that Europe has to push ahead swiftly on defense spending. It has to address capability shortfalls. It needs to work more closely with partners. So if I can quote the EU's chief diplomat Kaja Kallas, strengthening European defense also strengthens NATO. So it's widely regarded that this push is symbiotic as well. Beyond that, of course, I think Rutte has tried to ameliorate the impact of Trump by suggesting that there has been tough language, and there's very real worries and concerns about the US long-term commitment to NATO. But he said, and continues to repeat, that it's logical for Europe to step up even more. So what does this all translate into? Obviously, new funding opportunities and also new projects as well. EU leaders getting very close, I think, to agreeing a list of roughly 20 specific defense investment projects for a summit in June. And there are big gaps, and perhaps we can talk a little bit about these, specifically in air defense systems and long-range missiles and military mobility. But there are very real divisions, I think, that the European Union itself is going to have to overcome, specifically between its member states, when it comes to strengthening Europe's security, job one, boosting its defense, job two, and then building strategic autonomy, job three, and probably the toughest of the three as well. There are a number of divisions, as I'm sure we're aware, among the member states. And the first, of course, concerns the who's in charge, who should oversee European security. So here, I think we have the traditional division between Atlanticists on the one side and Europeanists on the other. Certainly the Atlanticists have promoted and continue to suggest that NATO and by extension the United States can and should continue the security provisions for Europe as a whole. And on the other side, you've got a more EU-centered approach that emphasizes strategic autonomy. So you've got a bit of a division there, if you like. That strategic autonomy concept, I think, might be one we might like to unpick. What it really is talking about is trying to make Europe self-sufficient, standing on its own. But that suggests a very different kind of European architecture, very different European framework, possibly wider than the European Union itself. And that makes some member states very squeamish. They're very hesitant to grant significant power to the Union in areas of security and defense matters. And the idea of perhaps extending that architecture has left them a little bit leery. The next one, of course, is funding, and that's a really critical debate. It's not so much who, but it's where. Where's the money going to come from? And we've seen a variety of options popping up, and I'll go through those in a little bit more detail when I talk about the EU-UK pact, because I think they're a little bit more clearly outlined there. But the point is that the financing options at this point are perhaps almost as large as the philosophical options facing the European Union and Europe as a whole in terms of how to move ahead. So certainly some sort of hybrid approach, I think, is going to be needed. Also, I think in terms of how that money is spent and where it's spent, the third area of division perhaps is the buy EU area, the idea that something like the European Defence Fund, when it was founded a few years ago, established pretty clear rules for EU subsidies requiring applicants to be based within the European Union or specifically associated countries to the European Union. But I think that's changed. I think the war in Ukraine has amplified the debate over the need to develop very swiftly European defence in a much more flexible and perhaps a more hybrid manner, and to think more carefully about perhaps the percentage as to what can be manufactured where. 65%, I think, is the amount that's being thrown about at this point. So we have seen some major changes there. Factors, therefore, that are going to shape the EU's approach to defence also roll in defence industrial policy. It's really difficult to pull those apart. The continuing impacts, which we should talk about, of course, is from the US itself, or US politics. Certainly the United States, whether it supports or opposes such efforts is going to be critical. But given that the welterweight at this point is on US support for Europe stumping up and pushing EU towards greater autonomy, I think perhaps that's the direction of travel at this point. So it does come down, in some sense, to the economic and financial preferences of the EU member states and fiscal liberals on the one side and fiscal conservatives on the other. Not so much just simply about the level of spending, but also the structure of spending as a whole. So just to finish up, let's talk a little bit about the emergence of the EU-UK Security and Defence Pact, something that needs to be put together at least in broad fashion ahead of the 19th of May EU-UK Summit being hosted by Prime Minister Starmer as well. And the point here is simply to formalize an agreement, to formalize a defense and security agreement, a sort of memorandum of agreement, MOA, if you like, quite similar to those that the EU has already signed with other countries like Japan and South Korea and Albania. And the point of this one is to affirm the UK's renewed involvement in European defense matters. So bringing them in, nailing them down, and also making very clear the role of UK participation in EU defense procurement. So here comes the part about how to fund the thing. And there are a number of opportunities. The first one, of course, is the Joint Arms Procurement loan program, and that's 150 billion euros, a loan program for military procurement, which the European Commission has made contingent on the UK signing the European Security and Defence Pact. Right now, that program, as it's emerging, currently excludes non-EU countries. So certainly getting that under starters orders is important. More importantly, I think, than that is the 500 billion euro joint fund for common defence projects and arms procurement, so procurement and projects as well. That fund, the sort of bond market connection, the bonds, if you like, that fund would tap into bond markets to boost spending, particularly and in anticipation of potential changes to US policy as well. And then another one is the creation of an armament bank modeled on the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So that's a government-owned lender that would provide loans for the purchase of military equipment and industrial projects in the defense sector as well. So those are the sort of big areas. And as I mentioned, there's a sort of undercurrent of buy European behind all of those, a buy European approach to defense spending. And the EU, I think, needs to think carefully and a bit more strategically about leaving the door open for third countries to participate if perhaps they sign something like a security and defense partnership with a bloc. So I know we've got lots to talk about. I'm going to finish there and look.
Internal difficulties within the European Union as it begins to grapple with some of these issues. I mean, obviously, we have countries like Hungary that have a rather different view of Ukraine and Putin, perhaps from the majority, but equally there are other countries who perhaps are more reluctant to get involved in big spending than some of those who are more on the front foot. Is there a danger that if this European Defence Union is all to be inside the EU, that it'll be lowest common denominator, proceed at the speed of the slowest? Would it perhaps be a more urgent response to what's going on if it were shaped as more of a coalition of the willing?
Yes, I agree. I think that there's a profound risk of lowest common denominatorism. And perhaps for that reason, we're seeing separate planks, separate options, if you like. You've got the loan program, then you've got the joint fund, then you've got the rearmament bank. So it seems to me that the Commission is sort of building up a multi-level framework, which hopefully should work in cooperation with each other. But what I have seen, I think, is some changes. Specifically the joint fund, the 500 billion euro fund, that is being put together on a voluntary basis, and that's new. So member states are not compelled. It's not the sort of joint borrowing that really wound up a number of the more fiscally oriented member states before. If that's the case, that means, first of all, that EU restrictions on using common funds will be alleviated, and also that how do I put it, military neutral member states like Austria and Malta won't necessarily feel compelled to veto it. So I think there is some scope, and I do see some hybrid options in what's been put forward by the European Commission at this point.
I think it's come as a bit of a shock to some people that the countries of Europe don't believe we could even sustain a peacekeeping operation in Ukraine without American support. But nevertheless, many learned military voices have made the point that we are heavily dependent on the US for satellite intelligence, for supply logistics, air cover, and several other things. And it could be anything up to a decade before Europe could genuinely be strategically autonomous. Do you think, therefore, that European leaders have to some extent got to keep reasonably civil relations going with Donald Trump, because we do depend on American support for the things we want to do in the short to medium term?
Yes, I completely agree. I think it's wise in any regard to keep diplomatic avenues open. This is a profoundly medium, even long-term set of endeavors. You might be able to set the funding structures up pretty quickly, but the building up of capacity, the developments of those projects, the enhancement of procurement, and above all, interoperability, that takes a huge amount of time, as the British and French bilaterals under the aegis of the Lancaster House Treaty have demonstrated. It's a really generational type of project. So even if we get going right now with the best will in the world, we might have small ops-based projects, which I think is something that NATO has actually developed really, really well in the next couple of years. But the idea of increasing the carrying capacity of the European defense ecosystem as a whole in anything under than 10 years, I think would come as, you know, a benefit and a real plus.
Do you think a European defence union would eventually grow up to be a European pillar of NATO, or do you think we're on a course now where inevitably it and NATO will end up completely separate and apart?
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because the European home, the European forum, the European pillar within NATO has existed, but never easily. You can go back as far as the Western European Union to get a sense of, you know, whose home is it, and also the degree to which NATO exists as a defense ecosystem within the European Union. I mean, it's kind of bittersweet, but I think if there's one thing that the Ukraine crisis has done at this point, it has overlapped and deepened the security and defense thinking and also the hardware between the two. So what I'm beginning to see, I think, is quite clearly defined contours with much scope, obviously, much more potential yet to go, of an EU forum. Not necessarily within NATO. I used to think of this in a series of concentric circles, but it's more of a Venn diagram now, I think, in terms of overlapping circles. And it's really up to, I think, the member states are the ones in the middle, the member states that are also the members of NATO, to be able to push equally, not necessarily in opposite directions, but to be able to pull in parallel dimensions, if you like, to move the entire objective forward.
Amelia, thank you very much indeed. Please don't go away. I'm going to move to introduce our other speaker, Tim Hames, now. Can I just say to everybody, opportunity to ask questions in a few minutes, and you can do that by means of posting them in the chat, which is part and parcel of the software that you've logged on through, and we will be collating those and bringing them together ready for our panelists to answer in a few minutes. But for the moment, I'm going to introduce our second speaker, Tim Hames, who I have known for more years than I think either of us would probably care to remember. Tim has a very interesting background in the sense that he is an Oxford contemporary of some of the more colourful characters on the British political scene over the last 15 years or so, although I think it's highly unlikely that he frequented the Bullingdon Club in their company back in Oxford days. I first got to know Tim when he was a Times journalist, a columnist and a leader writer. He He later went on to become the chief executive of the British Venture Capital Association. Our paths crossed again when he, for a spell, was a communications advisor to the House of Commons. His duties, I think, the risk of being indiscreet, were to try and keep the spouse of the Speaker of the day out of the media as best as possible. I'm afraid it was a case rather of his being appointed after the horse had bolted, but he did a fine job anyway. He has more recently written a book about Donald Trump, Trump 2, why he won and what it means for the world. And I'm sure that he is going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. And he is now one of the founding partners of Acuity, a geopolitical consultancy. And Tim, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Over to you to give us your views on Trump, what you thought was going to happen, what has happened, and what you think it all means. Tim.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much, Amelia. First of all, at a sort of higher level, there's quite intense competition for which region of the world is being most disrupted by the Trump 2 presidency. But and you can make a case that it's China or stroke East Asia. You can make a case that it may turn out to be the Middle East. You can make a case about Latin America. But I think by a reasonable distance, not a short head, it probably is Europe. And that's really for 5 reasons, and they're actually not to do with Donald Trump's unpredictability, but his predictability. In that curacy, whilst it is true that Mr. Trump, in terms of tactics, is very, very hard to predict. I mean, what he actually says or does or posts on Truth Social on any particular day is a matter of speculation. Actually, in terms of his instincts and, if to use a rather grand term, strategy, he is rather more predictable. And for Europe as a whole, I think there are 5 areas of profound tension which in theory should be separate, but in practice might end up getting messed up with one another. And they are, and I'll try and keep this brief. Firstly, an attitude across the board which largely devalues or even dismisses multilateral institutions as actors in the international arena. And that affects Europe and the European Union more profoundly than most, because the European Union is the mother of all multilateral institutions. I mean, that's in many ways its purpose in life. And so a world in which that matters less, the G7 matters less, NATO matters less, even the IMF and the World Bank may matter less because of a diminished American appetite for meaningful participation, means more for Europe. The second issue, and one which has been surprisingly quiet given how brutally, really, the president removed himself again from the Paris agreements, is on climate change. Europe is the fastest warming continent on the planet, as far as we can measure these things with absolute precision. Issues around climate change, therefore, matter more in Europe than they do elsewhere. It is very hard to imagine a comprehensive strategy to deal with climate change in which the United States is not merely a non-participant, but actually actively hostile to the underlying concepts. This is not, it's in a sense, it's worse than in the 1920s when the US refused to join the League of Nations. They're actively arguing the League of Nations is a bad idea. The third, obviously, and we've seen in terms of tariffs and trade, which again is more profound for Europe than elsewhere, because Europe has a much more open economy than that of the United States. Exports as a proportion of GDP are much higher across almost all European countries than they are in the US. The US is still in many ways and in many sectors quite a closed economy because it's a very, very large domestic market. Fourth, obviously, the fate of NATO, where I think people are still kidding themselves if they think a relatively small increase in defense spending and GDP is somehow going to wish this issue away. And then finally, and most immediately, Ukraine, where I think the really difficult issues between the US and Europe will be if the US succeeds in more or less imposing a settlement on Ukraine, the end of the parties, but with a whole series of side deals that Vladimir Putin is going to be looking for. He's going to be looking to end his status as an international pariah, perhaps even rejoining the G7/8 as early as next year. He and his intimates, who are the subject of personal sanctions and travel restrictions, are going to want all that swept away. And then there's the whole question of frozen assets, where I think on all three of those elements, the Trump administration will be inclined to be much more forgiving to Moscow than European leaders will be remotely comfortable with. So these are really, really big issues. And if they don't trigger at least innovation, I mean, whether or not the exact outcome of that will be something that one would call a European defense union is a matter of tactics and anything else. I mean, there's a slight risk that if you start inventing new names for things, those parts of the American administration that really wish NATO would go away would say, thank God for that. Yours and off and running. So I think the process of transitioning from where we are now to where we need to be is A, going to be expensive, B, going to be complicated, and C, going to require some considerable diplomatic depth, that we don't end up in a no man's land where NATO is functionally, if not technically, deceased, but its replacement is not there in any meaningful form. And I think that's the real challenge for European policymakers. And it is going to require someone, perhaps the current NATO Secretary General could do this, to be the bridge between A and B. Otherwise, it could be extraordinarily messy.
Tim, thank you very much for that. Excuse me. Is Trump a strategist at all?
But depends on how grand a term you put strategy. But does he have a worldview? He certainly does have a worldview, and he's held it for a very long time. He took out full-page adverts in New York tabloids in 1987 to expound his views on economic policy and foreign policy, and they are remarkably similar today to what they were then. So the notion he's just sort of tariffs is something he's just sort of woke up on one Tuesday and sort of thought he quite liked the sound of the name is alas false. So and also the force of the Trump emphasis means that even if his successor is a Democrat of considerably different inclinations, you might get some movement on the first two of my points, back towards multilateralism and more active involvement in climate change. But those two areas are now going to be almost permanently red-blue divisions within the US. The Ukraine ship will have sailed. No one's going to win any great number of votes in an American election by wanting to appear softer on tariffs and on European defense spending than their opponents and the president's been. So, the chances are that even if he's not a strategist, the outcome will be strategically consequential.
Where do you think the tariff war ends? I mean, where does it all get to? Trump seems genuinely surprised by the reaction of the markets and the reaction of the world to his tariff policy, but I think many people thought that 200 plus years of economic history made it all perfectly obvious what would happen. He only seems to see things in the moment. Where does this tariff war get to in the next 12 or 18 months? Well,
the most optimistic view on that question would be that the internal debate within the administration between various figures of this now appears to be pretty comprehensively won by the Treasury Secretary, who is the most mainstream of the senior Republican economic figures, and also by temperament probably the most capable of finding what will inevitably be a patchwork quilt solution. The notion that we're going to have as some sort of universal solution by early July, when the 90-day period expires, strikes me as extraordinarily optimistic and implausible. There may be a few high-profile deals signed before then, but for the really large players in this game, which are essentially the European Union, Mexico, Canada, because of the nature of their integration with the American economy, and China, there's not much incentive to move first and settle first.
Yes. Keir Starmer has been very much of the view that we do not have to choose between closer relations with Europe or America. Indeed, he sort of doesn't think that we should. And for understandable reasons, the British government has been having exploratory talks with Washington to see what can be done on the tariff front. But it seems to me that if Trump is particularly keen to have high tariffs on automotive products and pharmaceuticals, and these are two of our biggest British exports to America, there's not much doing there. And if the other thing Trump wants is to get American food in here, but that would be completely incompatible with us improving our food veterinary arrangements with Europe, it doesn't seem to me to be an awful lot of scope for a cozy deal between Britain and the US.
No, there isn't. You can find bits and pieces that you could put together in the sort of spirit of those of a certain age of Blue Peter and John Noakes, sort of, and say, look, it's a deal. It must be. It all sticks together, doesn't it? But on those fundamentals, you're quite correct. And it's a very, very difficult balancing act for the Prime Minister, because it's very difficult to sort of be seen to be out there looking to have a preemptive beneficial deal with the United States on a Monday and then turn up in Brussels on a Tuesday and sort of say it's time to sort of kiss and make up a bit. So, I mean, you really, really have to wonder how he's going to manage that balancing act. And especially as obviously mainstream opinion in his own party would, rather run to their heels than was seen in Washington with Mr. Trump.
Thank you. Well, we would very much welcome some questions from our online participants this evening. I look forward to hearing what both Tim and Amelia have to say. Have we got a question? Yes. We have a question from Joe Pye. Is the EU warming up to permitting the UK to join the procurement process? Amelia, you touched on this. Do you want to have a quick go on that one?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. And thanks, Tim, for what I thought was a really eloquent tour d'horizon, if you like, of an increasingly fractured world. Well, Joe, this is a really great question. This is going to be at the very heart of the current negotiations and part and parcel of the summit that we're going to see on the 19th of May. Yes, I think the EU is warming up to permitting the UK to join joint procurement. I think there's a shift in sentiment, let's put it like this, among EU leaders on the one side, and I think it's driven by a renewed sense of urgency. First of all, there's, as I've mentioned, I think there's a renewed consensus to spend urgently far more on defense, and I think Tim's right on this. It's not just a drop in the bucket. This has to be a systemic change in approach to funding defense and even recategorizing defense in terms of the next generation of Europe's ecosystem. And again, as I've mentioned, those joint European funding mechanisms need to be fleshed out. They need to be clearer in terms of how to finance procurement and projects, industry and national defense, and then the pooling of those defense as well. It's clear to the European Union. It's become clear to the European Union that joint procurement is incredibly important. The welterweight of UK industrial base from the security and defense perspective, I think, is really overwhelming, just as a case in and of itself, but also because so many of these the key British companies have for many years existed, quite happily on either side of the channel. So in effect, they're already quite Europeanized. They're built and have been for decades, actually, into the European supply chains. So to some extent, they're already there in the fabric. The idea is being able to be clearer about what portions effectively are permissible. So we're going to come back to these slightly dull questions of what percentage, 65% here and there, etc. But if your question is a sort of broadly philosophical one, absolutely, and I think it's a very good thing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amelia. I suggest we press on to the next question. This comes from Paul Brown. Ukraine can't wait 10 years for Europe to strengthen its defense ecosystem. without Ukraine holding Russia back, Europe doesn't have 10 years. Will procurement of weapons for Ukraine be prioritized? Tim, do you have any sort of gut reaction to that? Any thought?
Well, I can understand the sentiment behind the question very strongly. I think the notion that, however, that if there is no deal, whatever deal means in the context of Ukraine-Russia, and the Americans basically walk away, the notion that their contribution could be easily duplicated via some sort of European consortia is, I think, extremely improbable.
Yes.
And as a consequence, really, Europe's hand is extremely weak on this one.
Yes, I'd have to agree with that. Amelia, anything you want to chip in there?
Yeah, I'm afraid time is against them at this point. They've had time and they've blown it, quite frankly. That's not to say that the urgency is to be commended. That's fine, and I'm pleased to see the multi-strut structures emerging that I mentioned before: the procurement initiatives, the loan program, the joint fund, the rearmament bank, and then there's the sort of bi-European, which can include the United Kingdom. But it's not a quick answer. I think the more rapid answer is probably what do we have within the current NATO structures that's going to be able to support Ukraine. But I don't know if we're actually at the stage of continuing to arm Ukraine. I think we are hopefully getting close to some sort of decision, some sort of proposition to try and at least attempt a ceasefire. And if that holds up, then we are looking at the next stage of reconstruction of some sort. So without wishing to predict, what the next few steps are going to be, Europe has no time at this point, and NATO really doesn't have the hardware or the scope to be able to continue to support Ukraine in terms of its hardware in the way that it has. Nor, I think, will the United States permit it. It's clearly got a very different perspective on what's supposed to happen next.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Let's move on to the next question. This comes from Owen Morgan. To what extent is it felt that the imminent minerals deal between the US and Ukraine might result in the kind of security guarantees that President Zelensky has been seeking? Amelia, do you want to have a go at that one?
I was always deeply suspicious of the minerals deal. I'd be keen to hear Tim's view on this, but for me, it was a massive distraction. I think while the U.S. or the Trump administration, at any rate, tried to get its ducks in a row, and also I think just suggests the deeply acquisitive, kind of absurdly, brutally acquisitive approach of Trump and his circle. It's simply you can identify a country that you think is full of goodies and simply loot it. It's a poor approach. It's an incredibly short-term, very sort of immediate approach, and it's not one I think that's conducive to the high, heavy diplomatic energy needed to move from ceasefire to peace. I'll make a plug for Canada here because it's really easy. If you're looking for a country just laden with minerals, I would have thought that a much more intelligent bilateral next step between the United States and Canada, instead of sort of knocking each other left and right with reciprocal tariffs or retributive tariffs, might be to look at who needs what in terms of minerals and rare earths.
Tim, Trump has tried to sell the world the idea that if America has a stake in minerals in Ukraine, then of course Russia wouldn't dream of attacking further in the future. But this doesn't sound hugely reassuring. What's your take on that?
No, I largely agree with Amelia. It's a rather strange sideshow. I suppose at the very, very, very margins, it is conceivable that if there were more Americans physically in the Ukraine, that might complicate matters moving forwards if Russia comes back for a second bite at some stage. But that's not a security guarantee.
No.
I mean, it's a security hope. In fact, it's closer to a security prayer, to be honest.
Indeed. Thank you both. Let's take another one. This comes from Ralph Elia. What sort of warfighting command structure would a European defence union have? I mean, I'm presuming it would be largely modelled on what we've been used to in NATO. But Amelia, do you have a thought on that one?
I would agree with you entirely. I think that's perhaps those are the clearest contours that we have at this point. I think what the EU needs to think is what it brings to the table. So we can't have duplication and reproduction while they're busy building new bits and pieces, projects and procurements, etc. Obviously, Europe needs to bring something that NATO, in a sense, not just doesn't have, but a new area of complementarity. We're really rebuilding the European defense ecosystem. And if it is going to take, as long as we fear it's going to, then the command structure itself has to line up with, but complement and augment, perhaps, what the current structure of NATO is, but also, given that it's a moving, feast, so to speak, what's it going to need to be in the next 5 to 10 years? So it's going to have to be a lot to do with strategic forecasting, I think.
Yes. Let's move on. Sleepy Sam asks, are Turkey and Hungary the Achilles heels of the European defence, as Viktor Orban and Erdogan tend to share similar values with Putin and Xi Jinping? Tim?
Well, I think obviously the questioner is on something quite plausible. I think in terms of thinking about an alternative or supplementary military structure, how you bring Turkey into that is a considerably greater challenge than what you do with Hungary.
Yes, indeed, quite.
And that is one of the problems, especially post-Brexit, that two absolutely critical players in a credible European defence, the UK and Turkey, are not in the EU, and therefore an EU-only based approach to this is going to start off with very considerable weaknesses. I would be more concerned about the Turkey end of this question than the Hungary end.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think Norway is worth just remembering as well, because it's so important geographically as well. Amelia, any thoughts on this?
Yes, I perhaps suggest that in terms of energy security, these two countries play really interesting roles. If we think a little bit more broadly about what constitutes European security. So I'm just going to sort of add that in there. Turkey's just incredibly important because of the some key pipelines that run across it. And I think in terms of supplying, at least at this point, natural gas, which is helping to offset the drop that the European Union wanted originally from Russian natural gas. But Hungary stands in opposition, obviously, to continued uses of sanctions against Russia that have energy as part of that package, part of that component. So Hungary is certainly an Achilles heel, if you like, in European defense, as you suggested, but I think even more so, the ability to thwart big systemic areas where the European Union can actually move forward and put pressure on Russia. And energy security is a really good example of that. And yet, Turkey at this point, which is more ambiguous, I think, in terms of its security relationship with Ukraine, is playing a more positive role in terms of its relationship with the European Union in terms of energy. So that's clear.
Thank you. Let's take another one. This is from Adrian Wyatt. France has offered to shelter other powers under its nuclear umbrella. Surely that must be part of the interim solution until the European arm of NATO is fully up to speed. Of course, the UK nuclear deterrent is already something that's sort of committed to NATO in any case, unlike the French one at this current moment. Tim, any thoughts on how we bridge that?
Well, I mean, I would be very cautious about sheltering under that particular nuclear umbrella, in part because I'm not sure French domestic politics after Mr. Macron goes will necessarily sustain it. And is it really going to have the same potential credibility as NATO Article 5? I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's not NATO 2.
No. Amelia?
Agreed. France has been, I'll just leave it there. France has been impressively ambiguous with regards to the French national interest in determining where its nuclear deterrent lies within the confines of NATO. They've gone to great lengths to be very unclear on that. And that's the way they want to play it. That's fine. The UK, of course, has, for the most part, folded in its nuclear deterrence within the NATO confine. I would have almost thought it might be better just to start bilaterally. There is scope for nuclear cooperation, different aspects of nuclear cooperation, again, in the Lancaster House treaties. So I almost wonder if that might be a better microcosm discussion to be had first, to see actually how they are aligned, and then to see how, if this works, they can be sort of transplanted and then extended within NATO. But Tim's made a very good point. Much of this is leader dependent. And yes. I do agree that Macron's perspective now and his whole push on European defense and security and strategic autonomy and maybe rolling, nuclear support into that could be very, very different under another leader.
Thank you. One more question. This is from Jackie. Is there a path to moving away from reliance on the US for defense systems infrastructure? Amelia.
I think we're sort of beginning that path, actually, Jackie. I think the idea is probably to identify, well, maybe the step before it is to assume that the US is going to draw down the critical mass of hardware and software and funding, including troops, but also including its overall systems, including the very highly sensitive intelligence gathering and mapping and drone-related areas. Let's assume that is going to be drawn down. Now you've got a gap, you've got a vacuum. To what extent is Europe, with the UK and NATO, able to identify that gap and credibly, with increased funding over the next 2, 5, 10 years, move from that US reliance to a more autonomous, strategically autonomous system of its own?
Thank you, Amelia. Tim, any thoughts on that or anything else you'd like to have a last word on before you go off to broadcast to the nation this evening?
Only that, in a sense, we are probably suffering now from not having thought about this issue much earlier. I think if it had been suggested in 1990 that 35 years later, NATO would be fundamentally the same except larger to the east, people would have said, really? Surely something's going to have to change within that structure, because the world in which NATO was originally created has changed. And I think it would have been much better had much more intellectual energy gone into space now, because now we're having to do it under the pressure of an administration that clearly, I mean, the signal conversation between National Security Advisor, Defense Secretary, Vice President, etc., just reveals something quite close to a contempt for Europe as a military, even as a political entity.
I always found when visiting Washington as a minister, whether I was talking to politicians or to uniformed service people or to Pentagon officials, they always talked about NATO in the third person, as though the US were not actually members. I think in Europe we tend to think of NATO as being America, with some European countries lending support. In the US, it seemed to me they very much regard NATO as being Europe, with America patting it on the head from time to time. And therefore, when Trump talks about the US potentially withdrawing from NATO, it doesn't really cause more than a ripple. It doesn't cause anything like the shockwaves in the US that we might feel here when he talks like that. But Tim, thank you very much for joining us. Is there a final word on Trump or a final prediction you'd like to make? By the way, just another plug for Tim's excellent book, available for all good bookshops, or at any rate from Amazon, Trump 2, Why He Won and What It Means for the World. Tim Hames.
No, only to say that the forthcoming back-to-back almost G7 summit, followed by NATO summit, the first of each under Trump 2 era, will be very, very difficult occasions.
Thank you, Tim. Amelia, a final thought from you?
Agreed. Actually, summits are the best and the worst of both worlds. They're convenient get-togethers and anniversaries and a chance to press a reset button. But if things have gone hideously wrong between summits, it's going to be a very, very awkward occasion. Yep.
Tim, Amelia, thank you both very much. Thanks to everybody who has joined us this evening. I'm sorry we are drawing it to a slightly abrupt close. Tim is going off to join a media panel and to broadcast to the nation, but we're very grateful that, Tim, you've been able to be with us this evening. We're very grateful, Amelia, that you hang on up there in Birmingham before starting your journey home. It's been a real joy to hear what both of you have to say. Thanks to everybody at home who has joined in, and I hope very much that we will see you again soon for some of our other webinars in the next few months. Thank you all very much, and good night.